get started. All right, can you hear me well? Perfect. So, welcome to another exclusive SUP Workshop. And we are doing those. It's a series of workshops where we invite experts to come talk about very, very key topics for startups and help you in your growth journey. And the idea is to give you tangible advice to actually get you through the next steps. And structure is, as always, 45-minute session and then 15 minutes Q&A. And yeah, feel free to jump in if you have any questions or thoughts. I'm sure Chris would be fine with that as well. Or if you feel more, if you're the more raising your hand emoji type of person, go ahead and do that as well. Happy to loop you guys in. We'll share the recording as always on the startuppeople.com platform, and I'll make sure that any late arrivals get involved in a smooth way. And when the workshop is over after 45 minutes, I will trigger a poll, which is a survey with a couple of questions that I would love to get your feedback on, so we know how to keep improving our workshops and our events and making sure that it's super good and relevant going forward as well. So it's my pleasure to welcome today's expert, Christopher Dobbins. Chris, we've known each other for many years. I think we met back in during the Twitter days, right?
Yes,
when I visited your office. Yeah,
that's right.
Get to drink some nice beers in your beer tap in your first big HQ downtown SF. Yeah. And yeah, I'm really happy to have followed your journey already, all the way through Uber, Twitter, DoorDash, and you have some super interesting perspectives, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about that. And yeah, you're an experience-oriented people strategist with an interesting background, as mentioned, and you've been through some amazing journeys with your companies. So we're looking forward to getting those insights here today. And I'm gonna pass the mic to you. And yeah, thanks for joining, Chris, and for everyone who's listening in.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sebastian, and thank you all for joining and creating space for me to share some perspectives that hopefully will be valuable for you. Just to fill in some of the gaps, I'm currently working at OpenStore, which is a bit of a change of direction for myself, having worked at much larger companies. That being said, those brands are quite large, but I did invest time and energy with them at relatively early stages. Twitter was 700 people when I joined. I left when they were about 4,500. DoorDash was about 900 full-time employees. While that seems like a lot, about 50% of that was a non-exempt sort of hourly workforce that wasn't the typical sort of corporate persona that I was essentially enabling. And then Uber was much larger at 6,000 people when I joined. By the time I left, 24,000 people in size, and so quite large. All that to say, those perspectives and those learnings that I've been able to gather over the years, I felt very compelled to apply them at an early stage startup, which was my motive for moving to a company called OpenStore, which is a Series B company. When I made the transition out of DoorDash, it was very intentional that I start somewhere at the Series A to C range. And the idea was to help these companies really build the people strategy and function the right way from the ground up, to limit as much throwaway work as possible, because it very much is viable. And I think it's easy for leaders to abandon the energy that's required on the people side. But the reality is we can do this from day one and ensure that we set ourselves up on the right foot. So with that, what I will walk us through is building teams for fast growth. What we'll talk about is, one, growing a team, we'll move into building a strong culture, which actually dovetails nicely into developing managers and really beyond that, developing leaders. And then we'll round out the conversation talking about compensation philosophy. And so again, feel free to chime in with questions throughout. And if we're running short on time, I'll try to expedite myself. But
Chris, I already have the first question. Apologies.
Yes, please.
Yeah,
Go for
yeah.
it.
Sorry, apologies, Seb.
No worries, Dan.
Yeah, Chris, I think this has the potential to be a very interesting, presentation. Do you mind sharing the presentation with Seb and the team after the conversation?
Absolutely. Yep.
I may have missed that. I may have missed that, Seb. Apologies, but yep.
Yep. No worries.
No worries.
You can accept it in your hands later today.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So, growing a team. I wanted to frame the conversation in the context of this quote by Keith Rabois, who is actually the CEO and co-founder of Open Store. He is also the general partner at Founders Fund. And so he operates both hats on a full-time basis. In essence, what this is saying is you're really building a team that in turn will build a product, right? And will eventually lead to the company that you are trying to establish. Now, it is a team that you build that will dictate the outcome, right? This belief, and I feel very adamant about this belief should lead focus on the quality of the people versus indexing on speed. Okay, it's all about quality, especially at the early stage. Now, I think over the past year, it's been very clear the buzz around the water cooler, so to speak, has been a lot around the Great Resignation, return to office, quiet quitting as well. And really, 2022, what we saw was very fast-paced shifts across the market. Employees and HR teams in which I've sat on alike have struggled to calibrate the expectations between the forces of mass layoffs and rising inflation. And I think we've seen that constantly, especially over the past, I would say, 4, 5, 6 months. In fact, we heard news today about Meta, which is about to go through another round of layoffs, having just done one in November. Now, what this tells us, whether you're an early stage startup, medium-sized company, or a large enterprise like Meta, is the idea of workforce planning. The concept of workforce planning, to be clear, is one that is typically reserved or at least invested in at much more mature companies. But really, what workforce planning is at its core is very simple. It's finding the right people with the right skills, putting them in the right place at the right time, right? We can all do that today, whether you're starting with your first employee, right? Or you're hiring your next sort of 200 employees. Right people, right skills, right place at the right time. And so right now, because of the market, we're constrained a bit, right? You're probably not experiencing layoffs in your own individual companies at the moment, but it's requiring you to understand exactly, being very, very picky on who you hire and when you hire them, okay? And not only when do you hire people, but how you leverage your employees. You might move them from one role to another, from one department to another, because their skill sets lend themselves with that ability. Now, the term hire for slope, not y-intercept, is one that I learned very deeply while at DoorDash. In fact, Tony Xu, the founder CEO of DoorDash, he and I had a pretty great partnership, and he held on to this mantra quite closely. And I think it actually led to DoorDash being able to hire extraordinary talent and ultimately be the market leader in food delivery in the US in very relatively, I would say, underdog fashion, right? We're operating against players like Uber, right? Uber Eats and DoorDash, with a very lean organization, managed to overtake the market, moving from 6th place into 1st place in a span of about 24 months. And so it's something to be considered. When we talk about hire for slope, not y-intercept, the idea is you want to hire people that have strong potential. not necessarily somebody who can do the sort of work that they have in front of them today, but someone who can learn and grow with the company and who can give value to the company as the company grows. All right. So the idea, and even for early stage startups, this is extraordinarily valuable because it puts you in a position to hire people that have strong potential, not to hire people that have strong backgrounds, right? We may not be able to afford them. So it's all about trying to find players that have high potential, right? And then lastly, skills and competency-based hiring. This is the sort of infrastructure that talent strategy sits on. And the idea is you want to increase as much structure consistency in the hiring process as possible. And the way that you find high potential people is identifying soft skills and hard skills that you think will yield success in your particular business. It's focusing on the skills, not necessarily the pedigree, right, of what school this person went to or what companies they worked at, or maybe even what role that they had before. If they are exceptional at these 4 or 5 skills that you sorely need in your business, you can teach them the rest, right? And they can find success. Again, understanding that skills and competencies is really a through line through the entire employee lifecycle. And when I talk about the employee lifecycle, I want you to consider it just as you would a customer. It's everything from talent attraction, right? To talent sourcing, to hiring, right? How do you measure performance against your talent and how you develop your talent? All of those milestones, you should be looking through the lens of skills and competencies. What are the skills and competencies that you're looking for when you're going out to the market to try to attract and to source a talent? How are you going to assess skills and competencies when folks come online on site to interview? And then ultimately, whenever they become employees, those same skills and competencies that you use to hire them and assess them should be the same ones, or they may shift a bit, but they're skills and competencies at their core that you are going to measure their performance. It's how you're going to develop a learning and development strategy around skills and competencies. Focus on those, okay? For number 1, when I think about identifying key skills and competencies, a much sort of mature approach is going to be skills mapping, right? And again, this requires a lot of energy. It might require resources that you may or may not have, but at the very simplest core, what you can do to identify the right skills and competencies that will yield success in your business is focus on your top performers. If you look at your top performers, maybe the top 20%, and think about what are the skills and competencies that this person has that they display on a day-to-day, and then identify those. I think oftentimes I hear leaders saying, give me more Jills, right? Or I need more Sarahs. But really what they're saying is, I need somebody that can do stakeholder management exceptionally well. I need somebody that can do data analysis really, really well. And Sarah does those things, and she applies them, right, with a ton of rigor and excellence. And so that's what you're looking for. So if you need help to understand what that looks like when you're trying to find your next hire, look no further than your top performers. Pull those skills and competencies out, okay? And then you're going to apply those in effectively what would be a job intake. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. But that's a session where you work with your recruiting partner. That may be yourself, right? It may be your co-founder, and you're focusing in on those skills and competencies. And those are what you're going to use to build your job description. It's what you're going to use to build your sourcing strategy. And then the third piece here is one that I hold on to very, very closely, which is the idea of structured interviews and working assignments. Because what I learned very, very well while I was at Uber, Uber had a ton of resources. We brought in consultants. And what we learned was there is a ton of research that says there are 2 measures that will yield the highest probability of success in a role, and that's structured interviews and working assignments. Structured interviews and working assignments. Those are the two measures that will yield the highest ability of job performance. Okay. And so I'll talk about that more at length. And then you look at, you start to move into the employee life cycle. Again, you want to use skills and competencies throughout the performance management process, but not just performance management process. Also, you want to assess new hires. And it might be at the 30-day mark, it might be at the 60-day mark, it might be at the 90-day mark. And the idea is you're quality checking whether you hired the right talent into the company. You might have heard the term quality of hire. And so that's what it is.
Yeah.
So Dan.
Go for it.
Yeah, apologies again, Chris. I got the point that you've been working a lot, Series A and bigger. I think a lot of the people on the call here today are pre-Series A, even bootstrap companies, and don't have access necessarily to structured interview templates, blah blah blah. I'm in a situation, I'm married to a wife who works in the HR sector, so I have access to pretty much everything in that regards. But I also see it that sometimes I was hiring too fast and I was relying on IQ, analytical data points, and not on my gut feeling, which I regretted later on. So how do you, perhaps in a pre-Series A condition, having that gut feeling situation and awareness, including, in the interview process?
Yeah, it's a great question. I worked with Tony a lot on that sort of same question, just trying to understand how he was able to hire in early days. Keith Raboy, also, I've spoken to him about it as well. In fact, what I'll do is I'll sort of frame it in how Keith thinks about talent, especially at the pre-Series A. And in fact, like I'm talking, if it's you, a founder, like what does that third person look like, the fourth, fifth person? He talks about it in the context of barrels and ammunition, right? It's a pretty provocative metaphor, but the idea is you want to hire as many barrels as you can, because barrels would be described as somebody who can carry something from inception to go live, right? From start to finish. They can carry it like a concept, an idea from start to finish like nobody else, right? They know how to charge up the hill. They know how to pull people along the journey with them, right? The idea of ammunition is somebody who is incredibly and relentlessly resourceful. It's clear that some people are better than others at just getting stuff done, right? You can have as many ammunition as you possibly can, which is relentless people that know how to get stuff done. But it's the barrels that you need, right, to grow your company and to give you leverage as an entrepreneur. So you need to hire as many barrels as possible, as early as possible, to give you as much leverage. Now, how do you do that in a pre-series, sort of a seed round or pre-series A? I think the concept is still the same, if I'm honest, which is to say, hire people based off of their skills, right? And not their pedigree. It's trying to understand that potential. And the way that you do that, it's not sort of clear, right? In terms of what they've done in their role. You really have to dig and understand. He talks about people that sort of fit that mold. They're often contrarian, right? Like, tell me, something that you believe in dearly that is not widely accepted by your peers, right? Help me understand a very complex topic and break it down in simplest terms, right? So there are some things that you can tease out with that.
Yeah, it makes a good metaphor with the barrels and the ammunition. It makes for a good blog post as well. I have to admit, very visual. So yeah.
Yeah, fair. Awesome.
Before we continue, just sorry for jumping in, Chris.
Yeah,
One another contrary thing when it comes to early stage companies is that you often get the recommendation to not think too much about what you need in the future, because you have things you need to get done today, right? And everything we heard so far is about planning for the future and structuring your team long term. And that's something that would love to like get your opinion on. It's like where do we draw the line, and when does it make sense for someone to be like, oh, this person is going to be with us for 10 years versus, okay, this seems like a fantastic full stack engineer, an okay community fit, let's go, right? What do we?
Yeah, it's a great question. In fact, I'm challenging our business today at Open Store around that very same challenge, right? Or problem, should I say? Because at Open Store, what I've learned is they're only, they recently started to extend their thinking to planning 3 months ahead. They were planning 1 month ahead in 2022. And in order to hire talent, you need to understand what your roadmap looks like, what your strategy looks like. Now, you may not understand what the roadmap looks like in terms of what products or what features you might be looking to build or design, or the next line of business that you think you might want to create on top of your current ecosystem. But you have a vision, right? And so it's leaning into that as much as possible to help give you an indication in terms of, okay, I think we probably need this sort of key role or this key role. And it might be a person that is exceptional at supply chain, right? Because we know that we know that the business is going in that direction. While we have multipliers in the organization to be able to give us that, there's going to be a tipping point when an expertise is going to be needed around supply chain. And so it's you really, really have to stretch your thinking a little bit and identify with some level of fidelity what your strategy could look like. And I don't have the perfect answer, because I'm literally trying to navigate this as we speak with leaders at Open Store. And it's just a series of questions, pulling and pulling. And I think you probably need, whether it's your co-founder or whether it's an investor or whether it's a mentor, to really run you through that exercise, because it's very, it's very easy to not look beyond, right, that sort of 1 month, that 1 month or 3 month marker. So to your point, Dan, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Okay. So here's an example of a job intake. Again, one, I will share this template with you, so you don't need to digest it all in full today. But the idea is, and again, this might not apply for your second hire or third hire, but I would encourage you to lean into the concepts and the idea of a job intake as early as possible, right? This template might not apply, but the concept applies, which is the idea that you want to identify the skills and competencies that you're looking for, that you need to be successful, bake that in to your hiring strategy from the start, and then use those same competencies and skills to identify how you want to assess the candidate once they come on site, or once they're at that sort of on-site stage. All right, sorry. Now, the next is structured interviews. Again, a strategy that might not apply for you today, but I still want to walk you through the concept of it, right? And I will let you understand whether you are ready to apply something like this or not. But the idea is, again, structured interviews are extremely, extremely impactful in predicting viability of success, okay? So one, it's reliable. I think structured interviews are designed to be consistent and standardized, which means, each candidate is asked the same set of questions in the same order. Now, this makes it easier to compare candidates, right, accurately. Structured interviews also risk the risk of interviewer bias, for example, more so than unstructured interviews. I will show you what the template of this looks like as well. 2, validity, and I mentioned this as well. Structured interviews are more likely to measure the skills and the abilities relevant to the job, right? This is because questions are carefully designed to assess specific job-related competencies. That's why it's such a high predictor. And then lastly, fairness, right? It's clear when you have structured interviews, they promote more equity throughout the decision-making process, right? And it's easier to sort of validate whether it's to your colleagues, whether it's to an employment counsel, right? Whether it's to the candidate as you give them feedback. So this is just a rough sort of visual on how structured interviews sort of looks. And so the idea is you can see on the right, your set of candidates that you may have interviewed. The competencies you see here are on the left, right? Competency 1 might be stakeholder management. Competency 2 might be communication. Competency 3 might be distributed systems, right? You have the same set of questions, and each interviewer is going to ask the same set of questions in the same order to each candidate. And then you're going to apply a score. And you can notice there's a weighting aspect to it, because some competencies/skills are a nice to have and some are a must have. Now, if you apply this concept, the idea is it's going to give you high fidelity in understanding the difference between candidate A, B, C, D, E, so on and so forth. Does that make sense? Any questions to that end?
Yeah. I know it definitely makes sense, and really important with the weighting variable. So because it makes the numbers and the scoring become more connected to what we think is important.
Absolutely.
So that makes sense. One thing that I'm missing though is when you're scoring competencies, I'm assuming that there's somewhere else or something else where you connect values, culture, principles of operations, and those more softer values than maybe core competencies.
100%. And you know, even at Uber, it was very important that we did that. And so we applied it in the same sort of concept. And so it might be inclusivity that you're focused on. It might be culture that you're focused on, maybe some of those behavioral aspects. But the idea is you want to be able to define a set of questions, right, that you're going to ask each candidate, and you want to ask them in the same order. So absolutely.
Yeah. So the competencies could be scoring on softer values as well.
100%.
Got it. Okay, cool.
100%. Yep. Okay, I want to transition into culture. Okay. Now, I think oftentimes executives are confounded by culture because much of it is unspoken behaviors. It's mindsets, right? It's social patterns. And in my experience, partnering with founder and CEOs, whether it's Tony, whether it was Jack Dorsey, or even Keith now for that matter, but especially Tony, I would say, founder CEOs, they sort of wear many hats throughout the maturation stage of their company, right? But there are 2 enduring scopes that actually Tony has mentioned to me, and I sort of held on to it, which is they consistently own strategy and they consistently own culture. The strategy aspect piece can sometimes be transitioned to other leaders in the business. And in fact, you know, I saw this quote once where it says, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so the point here is, as a founder, as a CEO, as a key leader in a startup, it is incumbent on you to own the strategy. Don't relegate it to another person on the team, whether it's the people leader or otherwise, because it's not important, right? Own it, right? And leverage your leaders and your partners and your co-founders to help build it. Now, I've had the good fortune of working at Twitter at a time pre-Elon Musk, okay? At a time when its culture was one of the strongest in Silicon Valley. There was a high degree of purpose, a high degree of care, a high degree of learning that just permeated throughout the company. Now, culture isn't just about values, to be clear, right? It's a component, but there's much more aspects to culture that you should be considering, okay? Vision, for example, right? A strong corporate culture starts with clear and compelling vision. At Twitter, what this looked like for us was Jack Dorsey, Dick Costolo, who was the CEO for the much of the duration that I was there, called Twitter the global town square. The idea was it gave people a voice, right? It broke down sort of social barriers. What attracted me to Twitter, for example, was the Arab Spring and the sort of utility and strength it gave to the average voice. And so that vision was it really anchored how we thought about our strategy at Twitter, right? How we talked about what we wanted to be, how we operated. So it was very much a part of who we were and how we operated, okay? The values were very much palpable on a day-to-day basis. I mean, like, they were on our laptops, they were all over our walls. They sort of framed how we planned, they framed key meetings. And so they weren't just, a set of words that were prescribed and shared and then sort of forgotten. It was very palpable on a day-to-day basis. The physical space, right, was absolutely beautiful and it was accommodating. Sebastian was there, right? It was unlike any other physical space in San Francisco proper, right? It was almost like Google or Facebook, which is 50 miles south in Silicon Valley. It was almost like it was sort of dropped in the middle of San Francisco, and it felt like this sort of oasis of just community, right? And so the physical space lent itself to our culture that we wanted to be. And so I encourage you to think about these sort of 6 things as you aim to shape your culture. And again, I recognize there's a lot of words on this slide, but the idea is, you'll be able to take this back and digest it and see how it might work for you. One of the cultural pieces that resonates most with me and that I believe in dearly is transparency. Because I believe the idea of transparency, it unlocks a lot of potential in your business. Right? It builds trust and it improves decision-making. Now, what did this look like at Twitter? So, for example, Jack and Dick had this, and I'll speak about them in sort of parallel, but they had this idea of radical transparency, right? So everything was shared amongst employees, and not just in sort of theory. Even the physical space, it was very intentional. All the rooms were just clear glass because the idea was there was no secret meetings that were happening. There was no secret whiteboard session. There was no secret sort of special VIP that was coming into the office, whether it's Kobe Bryant, right? Or Tom Hanks, everything was just this big sort of town square where you could hear and you could see everything that was happening. Everything was shared. Board meeting decks were shared, right, across the company. Even when we went public, the company, our leadership printed off S1s, our S1 filings. They made them into books and they handed it to every single employee because it was something that we felt accountable to now to the public as a publicly traded company. Everything was communicated.
One question. Can you hear me, Chris? Yeah. Gives you a break to get some coffee.
Yeah.
It's very early your time. No, so obviously for Twitter, it's a social medium with a very you can contact any leader on the platform. So it's all about transparency. But and you mentioned Twitter, which is super nice. But what about DoorDash? What about the other founders, leaders you work with, did they embrace the same level of transparency? Or, and I'm assuming not, but did you see that, okay, they did it so exceptionally well that you just recommend it for all founders in general, no matter the size, or up to certain size, Series B or C or whatever?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And we'll talk, I'll actually share more about Uber in just a moment.
Yeah.
But I would say with DoorDash, this very much resonated at DoorDash, and Tony held on to our culture very, very closely. Founders and CEOs, I think, are very, very different than CEOs, if I'm honest. So when I sort of think back, I had the opportunity to work with at each company, founder, CEO, less so at Uber, because Travis was ousted after about a year that I was there, rightfully so. But I think the idea and how you shape your culture, it starts from day one, right? It starts from day one. You define that from day one. I will say that as you continue to grow, it might evolve over time, and you should be aware of that. And in fact, I'll speak to that in a moment. But the idea is culture is so important, and it shapes who you are and where you want to be, that it should be focused on from day one, whether you're pre-Series A or whether you're a publicly traded company. It is the foundation of who you are. One thing to this point that I'll just share quickly about Twitter is, I think it could be provocative to share all that information, but Jack sort of had this concept where he had everybody sort of commit to this idea that we would let information flow throughout the halls, right? And it was up to us to protect that information. And if that information was compromised, it affects us as employees, it affects our families, right? It affects like our livelihood, because in essence, it could affect your stock, your compensation, right? And that affects your livelihood. And so it sort of brought it back down to this sort of human element of trust. And it was something that we held very, very dearly. And so I think when you consider transparency, I'd urge you to allow information to flow. As you consider writing your cultural values, again, one piece of your culture, right? And we looked at six various components. I'd encourage you to be very, very specific in how you draft those values. It's easy for people to misconstrue what a single word means, right? A single word like transparency, for example, can mean 10 different things to 10 different people. So try to be as specific as possible as you draft your cultural values, right? And as you sort of introduce them, storytell, right? Give context and perspective of what the value means and what it means at your company. 2, collaborate with your team. I encourage you to work with your founders, your leaders, to help shape what your cultural values might be. I would actually urge you to involve your employees, right, as well. That might look like a survey, right? It might look like a jam session in a room where you whiteboard, right? Ask your employees, like, what are the values that resonate with them when they step into your building, right? When they operate within your company, right? When they partner with you, when they partner with their peers, what resonates with them? And then 2, as I alluded to, do not be afraid to edit, right? As you continue to mature and grow, it is true that what got you from A to B may not get you from B to C. And so, constantly revisit your values to ensure that they resonate not only who you are, but where you want to be, right? Now, this is where I'd like to dovetail, and I'll talk a little bit more about Uber now in this context, right? Developing managers, in my opinion, is the most important learning area for any one business. developing managers. There are many paths in how you can approach developing managers, right? But I'd like to approach by first looking at the intersection of culture and manager development, right? The intersection of manager development and culture. Specifically, we'll look at it through the lens of my experience at Uber, okay? As a people leader, this is where I learned the most. And this is purely by being in the environment that I was placed in, which was Uber. And so again, while the scale, as I go through this, while the scale of the environment of Uber is much different than most startups, and I'm sure much different than the environment that you're operating in today, the importance of manager development is all the same. Okay, it's all the same. And I'll actually touch on some of those points as well. Okay, so when you think about the intersection of culture and manager development, what you see here on your screen is a blog post. This blog post was published in February of 2017 by an engineer at Uber. Her name was Susan Fowler. Okay. This, by all intents and purposes, led to the firestorm, if you will, of Uber in 2017, where it really self-imploded. It wasn't a consumer brand issue. It was an employee brand cultural issue. Okay. Susan detailed in this blog her experience at Uber, where she faced, unfortunately, sexual harassment, discrimination, pay inequities. And she writes this blog post as she's transitioning out of Uber, and she transitioned to Sebastian's company, which was Stripe, at the time. And so this was an opportunity, right, where it unlocked the people team to rethink what Uber could be. And so because it was like an employer brand issue, the company sort of did an about face. They looked inward and said, hey, people team, what are you going to do to fix this? And that's why this became one of the most extraordinary learning environments for me, because it was in essence this sort of massive experience where we were transforming a very large company. That was 14,000 people in size, and we had a tremendous amount of resources to do it. Now I'm going to focus this next section on Frances Frey. Okay, so Frances Frey was or is a Harvard Business School professor. She's also, in my eyes, a corporate fixer. I think the term advisor, right, or strategy advisor is probably more appropriate, where she works with senior executives on how to transform a business. And so she was brought in as like the corporate fixer for Uber. And I will tell you, she is absolutely exceptional. She has an amazing TED Talk. So I'd encourage you to check that out after this call. And in fact, I will speak about the elements of that TED Talk, because that's what will be at the core of manager development, which is trust. Okay, trust. Trust is the foundation of everything. Okay, and it is the first skill that a manager needs. Right, and so that's what I'm going to focus on when we talk about manager development. So what are the ingredients to build trust? Okay, so Frances introduced this idea to us, which is the trust triangle, okay, which is authenticity, right? Which is, if you sense that I'm being authentic, you are more likely to trust me. Empathy, which is, if you feel that my empathy is directed toward you, that I care about you more than myself, you are more likely to trust me. And then logic, which is, if you sense real rigor in my thought process, you are more likely to trust me. Those three ingredients: authenticity, empathy, and logic. Now, empathy is the most common. Well, actually, let me take a step back. With these three ingredients, if you wobble on any one of these, you will compromise trust between you and your team or you and your partner. Okay, if you wobble on any one of these three. So the idea is to understand where you might wobble in these three so that you can be an exceptional leader and an exceptional manager. Okay, because you need trust. You need trust. So empathy is the most common wobble. Okay, empathy is built with time. It's the idea of giving space for people to be heard. People want to be heard. Okay, people want to be heard. Give them a space to do that. Understand, put yourself in their shoes and understand what they're experiencing, understand what they are feeling. Okay, at Uber, we didn't have empathy. Like, there was very, very little empathy. In fact, this is the one that stuck out the most. Francis talks about it as well. I mean, simple things like being on your phone in a meeting and not giving space to your partners that are collaborating in that environment. Like, empathy, you need to create space for others. Next, logic, right? Logic sort of comes in two forms. Quality and how you communicate that logic, or I'm sorry, quality of your logic and how you communicate your logic. So quality and communication. Communication, to me, is the most important. How you go about communicating your logic is extremely, extremely important. In my experience, tension arises or mistrust arises when expectations are unmet, expectations are unrealistic, right? Or expectations are unaligned. You need to over communicate, right? Over communicate. And then lastly, authenticity. Now, Francis describes authenticity as the most vexing, right? Which is, being you is easy when you're among like individuals and really difficult when you're in the minority. Okay, really difficult when you're in the minority. The more we hold back who we are, the more we are not trusted. Okay, and the less, if we're not trusted, the less likely that we're going to be given stretch assignments. The less likely we're given stretch assignments, the less likely we are to be promoted, right? Our job as managers is to create an environment where people can be their authentic self and they can communicate as such. Now, what's interesting is the relationship between trust, diversity, and team performance. In the context of authenticity, okay, in the context of authenticity, this relationship between these three is really, really interesting. Now, simply populating, I mean, it's very clear that diversity is extremely valuable, right? We all seek to build diverse teams. We talk about it all the time. Corporations, whether small or large, they invest energy, they invest thought into this, building diverse teams. However, simply populating your team with diverse perspectives and experiences doesn't always translate into better performance, right? It doesn't. In fact, the uncomfortable truth is that diverse teams can actually underperform homogeneous teams if they're not managed actively to allow their authentic selves to be brought into the workplace. Now, this is actually due to the common information effect, right? Which is outlined here, right? As human beings, it says, we tend to focus on the things we have in common with other people. We tend to seek out and affirm our shared knowledge because it confirms our value and our kinship with the group, okay? Diverse teams, by definition, have less common information readily available to them to make collective decision-making. So when you look at this relationship, the idea is create an environment where people can bring their authentic self to work. And those diverse perspectives and those diverse experiences that they have will flourish, right? They will flourish. Now, when they choose to bring their authentic selves to the table, which is actually what makes them uniquely valuable, by the way, their authentic selves, what we will find is performance will actually surpass that of homogeneous teams, right? And that is exactly what we're looking to build when we think about growing our teams from pre-Series A, right, to a publicly traded company, is to build high-performing teams. All right, I realize we're running short on time. Compensation philosophy is the last piece to round us out. So I do want to switch gears. I'll try to go fairly quickly to give us more space. Compensation, this is just the clear definition, which is the ability to establish principles and guidelines for how you think about and recognizing your employees through pay, as well as benefits, as well as equity. Okay. Now, why compensation matters, or why philosophy matters specifically. One, pay equity, right? You're creating structure and consistency in how you think about recognizing and rewarding your employees through compensation. It creates a level playing field. Two, you want to remain competitive, right? And that requires you to reevaluate your compensation philosophy on a recurring basis, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then three, going back to transparency. Now, this is actually important because it explains the why around why people are paid what they are. It explains the why, and that's the piece. If you can explain the why, people are less sort of angry, if you will, or less sort of confused around why they get paid what they do. Okay. When you're defining your comp philosophy, I'd encourage you to think about these 5 components. Okay, these 5 components. If you just think about it in this context, the philosophy and how you think about compensation or total rewards will begin to manifest for you very naturally. Okay, think about 1, your financial position, of course, right? And how you think about whether it's base salary or equity, if equity is something that you think about, and what's the sort of relationship between the two. Understanding your financial position is going to be extremely important, of course. Understanding what the market looks like is incredibly important. You want to make sure you're competitive. And so I encourage you to identify and work with various compensation partners, whether it's Paid or Carta, which I think do a really nice job for early stage companies. I will admit, I haven't really tapped into them for the international markets. But no less, there are providers that can give you that level of feedback and data of understanding what the market looks like. Then you want to actually have a perspective on determining your salary range position. What this means is, how competitive do you want to be? Now, when you think about a comp philosophy, there's basically 3 comp philosophies. There's lagging, right? Like you're lagging, you're either on par or matching, or you're leading. You're going to be leading the market. Now, I think in Silicon Valley, we tend to try to be in the leading, of course, and I think most players typically do. So when we think about percentiles, we usually try to operate at like the 75th percentile, for example. That's actually, in a perfect world, where for business roles or non-technical roles, I ideally would like to be at that 60th percentile, 75th percentile. But we tend to see for engineering, product, and design to be closer to the 90th percentile as well. And so that's pretty typical. When you think about the percentile in itself, you're comparing your talent peers. I'm not comparing like OpenStore to DoorDash, or I'm not comparing DoorDash to Facebook or Google. It's comparing your talent peers, and you want to operate and land at a certain percentile within your talent peers.
Yeah. So Dan, do you think you can hold your question to a 2-minute Q&A? So we'll let Chris wrap up.
Yeah. So you want to Chris go first or me go first?
Yeah. Let's let Chris wrap up since we have.
Exactly. No worries.
Thanks.
Awesome. And then the last piece is consider your benefits as well as being part of that total reward strategy as well as your comp philosophy. For example, in international markets, I know things like pension is extremely important. Commuter benefits are also extremely important. Whereas in the States, benefits is actually the #1 priority. And then things like pension or 401k. I think it's worth noting that compensation is actually based on supply and demand, nothing else. It is not. And so what you will find is you may get a lot of feedback of like, hey, this isn't fair, right? And the truth of the matter is compensation isn't fair. It's based off supply and demand, and there's sort of imbalances all over the place. And it's usually depending on the talent market. It's not around impact or value, right? Or even inflation. It's not about cost of living. If it wasn't a matter of impact and value, then teachers would be paid, right? Extraordinary salaries, which they don't. And so just keep that in mind. I want to quickly wrap up with these last 2 slides, which is around compensation sort of philosophies around how you pay. Okay, the first of which is you could use the same salary band for all countries, right? Now, I think some things to consider is like this is really, really expensive because when you're using one band for all countries, for all employees, you want to be competitive. So you tend to benchmark that on sort of a high percentile. And so I would say international roles, we actually tend then to base it off like a tier 2 or tier 3 versus a tier 1 because it's more cost effective. But generally speaking, if you're doing this, what you're saying is like, you have high margins, right? You have high margins and you can afford to find talent in multiple different countries. And you have this sort of remote first sort of approach with your talent strategy. Now, again, you have to have high margins. This is a very expensive way to think about it, which is using the same salary band for all countries, right? And then second is local pay, which is basically saying that you want to have salary bands that are specific to each country that you're operating in. Okay, and you will base that, you actually use the same sort of concept, and this is where the consistency comes into play. You'll use the same concept, which is to say that if we're paying 75th percentile, for example, in the US, we'll pay the 75th percentile in Sweden, or we'll pay the 75th percentile in the UK, etc. And so that's the idea, and it's really, really difficult to have a tiered approach, for example, across different countries, just based off of the various employer tax applications per different countries. So having local pay that are specific to countries, this is typically what we see and what, in my experience, compensation experts recommend as well, which is to have local pay.
Yeah, so let me just jump in here with, because if someone wants to, we're out of time. I'd love to continue for a couple of minutes. This is super valuable and interesting. Let me just, for those who need to leave early, feel free to do so. Let me just drop the survey, and feel free to respond, so we know what to how to improve the workshops. Continue, Chris.
Yep. And I mean, really, that sort of rounds the discussion out. I think compensation can be a very complex and tricky thing. And so what I would encourage you is don't be afraid to leverage outside consulting support to design a compensation philosophy, because this is something that's extremely, extremely difficult to walk back if you don't get it right. Okay, and I actually have a great resource that if you want to tap into a consultant that's familiar with the international market, particularly in Europe, I can actually forward that along to you as well. So that rounds us out. And happy to take any questions.
Awesome, Chris. Fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing those things. I'm going to leave. I have 2 questions lined up, but I'm going to let the members jump in first for questions. Do we have any questions? Crystal clear.
Yeah, I have one question. Hi, Chris. Thanks for sharing all this. One question I have, and this is interesting, especially if you have, like, as we have a mixed workforce with people, some here in Berlin, me myself being in Stockholm, and we just hired, a few more in Stockholm. Then we have some remote workers in Pakistan, Latvia, South Africa, God knows where, right? And it is a little bit of a challenge in terms of salaries, because here in Germany, obviously, we look in Germany. In Stockholm, we have to look in Stockholm, but we also need to somewhat align this. But the challenge that we're facing it for the physical locations, it's quite easy, because we know what the standard salaries are in Berlin and Stockholm. But in South Africa, for example, or Latvia, it's very hard. And like, obviously those people on the other side, they're not stupid. So they know you're international startup, they know where you're based, they are not going to be ashamed to ask you for the same salaries as you would have paid someone else, because they know you have the budget for it, right? But what's like the what's the general rule there, or like what's the advice to look at? And I found this actually last part very interesting, with the local pay versus global pay, very interesting, just because of that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I was in a conversation, or I was in a leadership summit 2 weeks ago, and we're chatting with a consultant expert, actually the one that I'm happy to reference. And she candidly shared that it's very, very difficult. And I think you will be challenged by your employees about equity and pay when you think about that. And the reality is, it's just not. Even if you think about Europe in itself, there are you can't actually just look at the salary. You actually have to look at the actual fiscal impact to the business. Because when you look at the total fiscal impact, you have to factor in employer tax. And it's very different, for example, in Italy, where if you look at Italy, the employer tax is like through the roof. Like, you would be surprised at how much the sort of cost burden or cost impact is for an employee in Italy versus, let's just say, the UK. And so there will be those inequities just based off of the cost impact relative to each country. Now, then what you can also consider is, how do you know what the market looks like? What is the cost of labor in, say, Pakistan or South Africa versus, for example, in Berlin? And that's where it's really, really difficult, because, again, to be fully transparent, it's really difficult to understand what the market is. Megna, who is this consultant, what she recommended and what she actually uses as a compensation expert is she tries to tap into recruiters to understand what is the cost for an engineer in this particular market, because they're closest to it. They know what the sort of vibe is today. So it's not stale data, it's relevant data. And they use that to help guide how you want to sort of position the band in, for example, South Africa. Another way you can approach it is to then also use maybe the countries that you have more fidelity, and using that as the benchmark. And then you base the percentile based off of that particular country. So it might be based off of Germany, it might be based off of Sweden, that the cost of labor, is more expensive, meaning there's less supply in Sweden than South Africa. Then you might say that we're willing to pay more, right, in Sweden. So you use a percentile of Sweden's bands, and for South Africa, and it might be 60th percentile, for example. Does that make sense?
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks for great question, Fidan. Do we have any other last questions? We are 8 minutes over time, so I want to have respect for everyone's time, and I also want us, Chris, to jump into the the fireside chat in a minute. So we have a little bit more time to talk. If you guys want to join on our socials, feel free to do so afterwards. Wrapping that up, unless someone else has an urgent question, then I want to thank everyone for joining, and special thanks to Chris for sharing your insights with us. And for our members, we'll do an upcoming session on OKRs and goal setting. We're going to do stress management, and we're going to do another session on no code. And there will be more sessions coming up soon. So, Chris, thanks so much. And I hope you get paid this month.
I know it's a good point. I think we're in a safe order. At least I've been reassured. So
good.
Thank you all. I really appreciate your time and energy and giving me space.
Thank you.
Feel free to reach out with any questions as you may have them.
Thanks. We'll be sharing the deck afterwards. So awesome.
Perfect.
See you.
Thanks a lot for
Thanks
organizing and sharing your thoughts, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a good one, you all.
Thanks
Take
all.
care. Ciao. Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you,
guys.
Sebastian.